As much as many loathe them within the Imperium of Man, no human can deny the importance of Psykers to their empire's continued survival. After all, it was a Psyker who founded the Imperium as a whole and still remains its spiritual leader to this day. That said, untamed and uncontrolled Psykers are almost certainly a bad thing if you're no fan of chaos, and so an organization was founded to monitor, train, and control those humans with psychic abilities. This organization's roles have evolved over time since its inception in the early Great Crusade, but its core goals have remained largely unchanged, even if the oversight and leadership definitely haven't. Divided into the League of Black Ships and the Scholastia Psychana, and represented on the battlefield by the Sisters of Silence, they are the former overseers of the Astronomicon and the ones responsible for all astropaths. They are the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. This is Tactica Imperialis, and welcome to 40k Stories. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica was founded in the early days of the Great Crusade, presumably before it even began, in fact, by the Emperor of Mankind himself. The Astronomicon had recently been constructed, or was still under construction, and the Astra Telepathica was primarily charged by the Master of Mankind with overseeing its operation and maintenance, no small task given the importance of the Astronomicon to the Imperium both then and now. This role has since been passed from the Astra Telepathica to the offshoot known as the Adeptus Astronomica, who now work closely with the former operators. But it was not the only task assigned to the Astra Telepathica back then. Terra had long been blighted by what would be known today as rogue psykers, some of which had become known as Witch Kings. The Astra Telepathica were charged with hunting them down, something that has continued to be a task of theirs, even with the Inquisition taking the primary reins, particularly after the inception of the Ordo Hereticus. To do this, the Astra Telepathica had armies of its own. Initially, these were the Sanctioned and Primaris Psykers, but even they began having issues eventually. It is not believed that there were any issues with the Psykers of Terra per se, but in the early Great Crusade a new militant arm was added to their forces, or had always been there all along and just kept in secret. It's hard to know for sure. The Sisters of Silence were an entirely female order of blanks, and their natural ability to negate psychic and warp-based power made them an invaluable asset for the Astra Telepathica, even if it probably wasn't a pleasant experience for any of their own psykers who happened to be standing around. Once the Great Crusade was underway, the Astra Telepathica's role largely remained unchanged. Hunt down psykers, the task of the Silent Sisterhood, and keep the Astronomicon running. But the rapid expansion of the Imperium meant that there was yet another task for them to do. As the ever-growing Imperium continued to expand, communication by conventional means became basically pointless. EM radiation such as light or radio signals from another system can take years or more to get anywhere, such is the vast inter-system distance, so a different approach was needed for anything long-range, such as coordinating an expeditionary fleet or passing down edicts from the Imperial War Council. To combat this, the Astra Telepathica had members known as Astro-Telepaths, often simply shortened today to Astropaths. I should point out at this point that psychic messaging as a whole over these long ranges is still a bad idea. Astropaths can do it, but only because they've been specifically prepared for this task, as I'll explain in a moment. Powerful but often weak-willed psykers, these individuals were, and still are, brought to be trained by the Astra Telepathica on Terra, at their headquarters, the City of Sight, which was later damaged after Magnus the Red's little disaster at the beginning of the Horus Heresy, so now they use a place called the Obsidian Keep instead. After several years of said training, the would-be astropaths then undergo a rather horrifying ritual known as soul binding. Supposedly first performed on Malcator the Sigillite, this techno-arcane ritual essentially involves a portion of the Emperor's own psychic essence being imbued into the astropath. I assume therefore the Emperor was so psychically overpowered that he could do long-range telepathy, but I can't remember him doing it particularly, so I can't confirm that. What this imbuement does is basically open up the astropath to the warp, presumably making them sensitive enough to detect the transmissions and also powerful enough to transmit them for themselves. Whilst this does achieve the desired objective, it is not a painless or a flawless procedure by any stretch of the imagination, both for the body and the mind of the astropath. The most obvious changes are the physical ones. Almost all astropaths are exceptionally frail and blind as a result of the soul binding procedure, losing their eyes in some cases as well as potentially the use of other senses too. However, the mental and spiritual changes are perhaps more severe. Personalities can be and often are altered by the experience, and it is not an uncommon occurrence for an astropath to die or go insane as a result of the soul binding. And despite being imbued with or boosted by a fragment of the Emperor's own ridiculously overpowered power, they are still susceptible to the warp's dangers. Demonic attacks on astropaths are less frequent than for other psykers, but they do happen, and the weak will of said astropath usually means that said attack, should it happen, will be a success. Oh, and one more thing. The messages can still take a long time to reach their destination, anything from a few minutes to a few months, depending just how far it has to go. The Telepathicus astropaths, however, still fill a role that no other can, and the fact that 90% of Imperial Psykers are exclusively devoted to this task speaks volumes about their importance and how many there needs to be, and also possibly their attitude towards Psykers as a whole. I don't know. They were also the only Psykers, along with the Navigator houses, to survive the blanket ban on Psykers in the Legiones Astartes following the Council of Nicaea. This edict may well have affected the Astra Telepathica as a whole, as they did have battle Psykers, and I cannot remember if the ban also stretched to theirs and the Imperial Army's forces, but it certainly affected the legions. This was the new state of affairs up to and presumably during the Horus Heresy. We know the Psyker ban wasn't lifted right away after the fall of the traitors, see Talos Rubio for an example of that. However, the ban was lifted eventually, though I forget exactly when, allowing the Astra Telepathica to continue to operate as it broadly had in the Great Crusade. But in the post-heresy era, one major thing had changed concerning the oversight of imperial authorities. The Emperor was gone, interred on the Golden Throne after his battle with Horus Lupercal, and the newly founded Inquisition had taken such responsibilities. This means that, assuming the pre-Nicaea restrictions weren't exceptionally tight already, the Astra Telepathica was walking an incredibly fine line. The Order Hereticus wasn't a thing for many millennia afterward, but we all know how the Inquisition can be when it comes to psykers and mutation within humanity, for the most part at least. As a result, the Astra Telepathica has remained under the stern watch of the Inquisition ever since, even though I couldn't find an ordo dedicated to the task, which did actually surprise me. They still operate the primary or perhaps sole psychic collection and training operations within the Imperium, having delegated to the Adeptus Astronomica the task of the Astronomicon. It hasn't always been a smooth run for them, but we'll come to that soon. For now, let's look at the primary subdivisions that make up the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. The first half of the Astra Telepathica, at least as far as its new members are concerned, is made up of the League of Black Ships. No relation to the Black Ships of the Inquisition, they're entirely separate entities with annoyingly similar names. If you want the difference, Black Ships for the Telepathica is one word, Black Ships for the Inquisition is two. Don't ask. This is the body of the Astra Telepathica concerned with the collection and recruitment of Psykers from Imperial worlds, and it maintains the second largest fleet in the entire Imperium beside the pretty much endless Imperial Navy. Only the Astra Telepathica knows truly how vast this fleet is, such as the size of the Imperium, the magnitude of their task, and the fact that it's never in one place at one time. However, as you might expect, these are not your run-of-the-mill Imperial vessels. No shock given the fact they have to carry around large numbers of untrained and possibly insane Psykers on a pretty much daily basis. They are covered in psychic wards, even built from a special psychically resistant material, and the crew is vastly larger than a standard one. Sources seem to conflict on exactly who is and isn't allowed to run and serve on a black ship. It is believed that inquisitorial stormtroopers or members of the Adeptus Sororitas must be present, as the Astra Telepathica aren't allowed to be wardens of their own ships, but apparently that's only at the discretion of the ship's captain, who is probably from the Astra Telepathica, so I'm a little confused. Obviously, Sisters of Silence are present, since blanks are the best Psyker shutdown tool that there is, but they went missing for a millennia or so before the War of the Beast, so I don't know who was standing in for them, and there weren't many of them at the time of the War of the Beast, so I don't think there were enough to go round, so what did they do? Not sure. And of course, there are a bunch of regular humans, all of whom are tested for mental fortitude before being allowed to serve, and also get some fancy anti-psycho weaponry to boot. They're recruited from worlds and possibly systems around Terra on a regular basis in exchange for exemption from Imperial tithes, and they serve under the Astra Telepathica adepts who actually run the whole show, whilst being regularly mind-wiped just to make sure they aren't being affected or corrupted by the job. Even their navigators aren't quite standard, as the Astra Telepathica has its own exclusive access to certain navigator houses. We don't believe they're much different in terms of function from typical navigators, since that job requires a lot of warp tolerance anyway, but given the lack of time off, I suspect they're a pretty hardy bunch. Though they have their own fleet, Inquisitors will also tag along with black ships as and when they please. After all, it gives an opportunity to see a wide area of the Imperium without having to charter their own resources, and it allows for investigations and risk assessments of the worlds themselves to be undertaken whilst the recruitment is going on. As for said recruitment process, there probably isn't all that much to say. Every planetary governor is tasked with gathering up a levy of psychic individuals whenever a black ship comes calling, roughly once a century or so. And the captain of the black ship, an adept of the Astra Telepathica as mentioned, will then assess this levy once they're loaded into the psi-warded holds of the vessel. This means that the League of Black Ships, for those who know of its existence and significance at least, are an organisation to be feared in the eyes of many. The coming of a black ship means that people you know, perhaps even you yourself, are going to disappear and never come back. And that's actually it really. The black ships have loops or circuits that they run as far as we know, hopping back to Terra whenever the holds are full to drop off their cargo before picking up wherever they left off. Once the drop-off has been made, the responsibility passes to the other half of the Astra Telepathica to look after, sort out and put to work the recruited or collected Psykers. This is the Scholastia Psychana, probably the deadliest school in all of human history in terms of raw numbers. They receive much of their intake from the League of Black Ships, but there are other sources too, such as the Adeptus Arbites or the Inquisition, that will likely gather up Psykers as part of their own plans or just by doing their damn jobs. Once they had said intake, the Scholastia Adepts must assign and separate their new recruits, depending on their usefulness and power level, whilst also factoring in age, willpower and some other things. One of the main measures for this, I assume, is known as the assignment, essentially a psychic power grading system ranging from Alpha Plus, probably someone maybe around Magnus the Red's level, slightly less, to Rho, no psychic activity, standard human, to Omega Minus, a blank. However, the exact separation of the grading and assignment is done is kind of irrelevant, but there are three main groups that the recruits will eventually fall into. The weak, old and or untrainable recruits are pretty much useless to the Scholastia in a long-term role, and they are used as sacrifices to the Emperor in order to sustain the Master of Mankind, a tradition started by the Sisters of Silence in the War in the Webway in order to keep the Terran Webway closed and free up the Emperor for other tasks. Believe me when I say this is not a pleasant experience. It's not just a quick execution, boom, you're dead, but more a case of having your soul drained by an immensely powerful pseudo-deity. Jeez, just saying that creeps me out. Yeesh. Those deemed malleable or powerful enough to not just be executed and sacrificed are divided into two further groups, primary and secondary Psykers. The secondary is by far the larger of the two, though almost certainly smaller than the executed pile. They are almost all trained to become astropaths as we've discussed prior, undergoing soul binding following their training and then being deployed wherever they're needed across the Imperium. The primary Psykers are those that most who only know the Imperium by its military will be familiar with, as they often go on to become battle Psykers of some kind. They typically receive about 5 years of training within the Scholastia Psykana before being shipped off to whichever military organisation can best utilise their skills. The Astra Militarum probably get the majority of them, either as individual Primaris Psykers or as covens of weaker Weird Vein Psykers, who may or may not become Primaris over time, and these are all affectionately known as bolt magnets amongst the distrustful troopers because lol Psykers. Some will go along with the Inquisition, becoming seers as well as demon detectors or decoys for those Inquisitors who are not themselves psychically gifted. And speaking of Inquisitors, of course the Scholastia Psykana also provides and trains those who will go on to become Inquisitors. Typically only the youngest or most skilled will get this chance, since an impressionable young mind is easier to indoctrinate and comes in a body that will last longer than a much older one. But for the very youngest, those who are still within the age bracket of Astartes recruitment and who also come with enough power that they might make it stick, there exists the slim chance of elevation beyond humanity to become a Space Marine. Granted, this isn't something the Scholastia Psykana is directly responsible for, as they will likely pass on the aspirant to a chapter who needs them, but both regular chapters and even the all-powerful all-psyker Grey Knights receive at least some of their recruits in this manner. Both primary and secondary Psykers can also be handed off to the Adeptus Astronomica for aid in their duties, though I cannot tell you what sort of percentage that entails. Perhaps this is just the pile that got executed, since the Astronomican also needs power and the Emperor needs power, and some say the Emperor powers the Astronomican but he might not. It's a little bit confusing, so I'm not sure. Once the recruits have been trained and passed on to their respective organisations, I do not believe they remain particularly close with the Astra Telepathica. Grey Knights forget everything about who they once were. I think Primaris Psykers are attached permanently, or at least become the responsibility of the Departamento Munitorum. Astropaths are still members of the organisation, they don't count, and obviously other Space Marines stay with their chapters, they don't need to go and make a call back to the Terror for any reason. To conclude this log, let's quickly look at a few major events and personalities involved with the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. Starting at the top, let's explore the master of the Astra Telepathica, an individual who can sometimes sit on the Senatorum Imperialis and who has direct oversight over both the League of Black Ships and the Scholastia Psykana, the only individual with both under their jurisdiction, though there are councils on both sides below them who probably run things. This individual is also something of a Psyker expert, as you might expect, as well as a powerful Psyker in their own right. So I was intrigued to find that the presumed master in the Great Crusade, known as Oculex Magister Jalisco de Jericho Suelta, was neutral on the idea of librarians when he attended the Council of Nicaea, as opposed to being in favour. Perhaps this Magister didn't see the problem with the ban, since it only really affected the Space Marines and potentially not his own forces. Or perhaps he was wary of the Astartes and Primarchs in general. We're not really sure, history doesn't record it, but his stance surprised me nonetheless. At the other end of Imperial history, we have one of the most recent, if not the current, master, a High Lord known as Zlatad af Karapliades. Apologies for probably butchered pronunciation. Karapliades was supposedly the member of the Senatorum responsible for tabling the motion that eventually saw the Adeptus Custodes freed to leave Terra during the 13th Black Crusade. I believe I may have credited Chancellor Lev Tiron with this in the past. If so, I apologise for the oversight. I discussed the Sisters of Silence in a previous log, and I don't believe there is much that I can add to that at this moment concerning developments, so hopefully there will be further information that comes to light, and if there is, I will publish an addendum as and when. However, there is one branch of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica that I have neglected to mention to this point, a specialist group of astro-telepaths known as the Cryptasians. Blimey, this lot have a lot of super long and hard to pronounce names, don't they? These astropaths are the decoders of astropathic messages sent with the highest priority, and they also are charged with executing astropaths who pose a risk of warp rift creation in an astropathic choir. The choir as a concept isn't actually as old as the Astra Telepaths, as it was only created during a post-heresy but pre-Nova Terra interregnum period known as the Forging, and it allows even weaker astropaths to perform their duties by combining their strength together. Astropathic dramas have also provided many of the major Astra Telepathica related events, usually incidents where a lot of astropaths end up dead, which on the small scale happens quite regularly. The transmission of particularly dangerous messages or high pressure transmissions can be enough to wipe out or drive insane entire choirs, but we're going to look a bit larger than that. For example, take the event known as the Howling in 401 M34. The Black Templars chapter of the Adeptus Astartes had been engaged in a war with a Xenos cyborg of immense power known as the Keiko Dominus, and when it died, the psychic death scream killed billions of astropaths with the echoes through the warp. Some say that this was also the war from which point the Black Templars renounced the use of Psykers that weren't astropaths and navigators, but I can't confirm that. And of course, more recently, there was the biggest screw you to the Adeptus Astra Telepathica probably ever, that being the Cicatrix Maledictum and the Noctis Aeterna. We're still not 100% certain about the origins of the Great Rift, though I think it is probably a combination of factors across all sorts of things, but its effects on the galaxy following its formation were dramatic and immediate. One of the biggest ones was a blocking out of the Astronomicon for those across the galaxy on both sides of the rift. The region on the far side, known to this day as the Dark Imperium, still has the Astronomicon's light obscured, making warp travel even more difficult. The time bending caused by the Maledictum, because, warp doesn't like physics, means that the blackness, as the Noctis Aeterna is sometimes known, has lasted for vastly different times on different worlds, and it rendered astropathic communication impossible at a time when demonic armies emerged en masse into reality. Overall, not a fun time. The effects, for Terra at least, faded after about 33 days, allowing the re-establishment of comms and a lot of quickly arriving distress signals from the now unblocked worlds. But the Astra Telepathica has continued to play a critical role in trying to deal with the Maledictum, as well as just trying to communicate in this new age. In order to re-establish links between Imperium Sanctus, the Terran side of the rift, and Imperium Nihilus, that being the Dark Imperium, the forces of Robert Guilliman's Indomitus Crusade needed to cross through the Montier-Var, and anyone who knows anything about warp storms knows that's a terrible plan that will just get you killed. However, the Sisters of Silence were able to put their blank power to good use, working alongside the navigators of the Navis Nobilite to make the travel possible, assuming the ships in question aren't running through the stable path that is the Narcomoid Gauntlet at any rate. This is particularly important given that the League of Black Ships is still having to make its Psyker delivery runs back to Terra. Having sisters and navigators capable of crossing the rift is vital for getting more of the Psykers delivered than might be typically expected, given the galaxy's been effectively cut in half. Granted, they aren't able to visit every world for one reason or another, and presumably every loop is taking longer due to the extra Maledictum traversal issues, which forces many worlds to deal with the Psykers that they would usually hand over to the Black Ships on their own. And trust me when I say this is the Imperium of Man, that will not end well for those Psykers. I suspect bolt guns. Either way, in this new era, I suspect the Astra Telepathica is as busy as ever, if not busier, since the warp power may have triggered latent Psyker abilities across many citizens, or just caused the Psyker mutation to develop more often within humans. Yeah, just because you've only got half a galaxy that you're effectively working in, doesn't mean you get the day off, particularly when you're messing with the warp. And there you have it, an insight into the actions and purpose of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. As the organisation responsible for all Imperial Psykers of almost all stripes, the Astra Telepathica continues to fulfill a vital, if likely feared and hated role within the Imperium of Man. They are incredibly diverse, from the invaluable astropaths to the Sisters of Silence, whose role has evolved and grown over time. And though the Imperium as a whole will likely never change its mind on Psykers, especially now given the Great Rift, only a fool could underestimate their importance both on the small and large scale. But for now, we must move on. Recently, we took the first steps into a very broad topic, and whilst we covered a good chunk of it, we are not done. So next time, I think it's fair to dive back in and explore it some more, looking at variants across the galaxy's factions. For now though, thank you for watching Tactica Imperialis, and I'll see you all again. Goodbye.